Hello, friends. I once again need to set this up. Okay, let's find the right window. There we are. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the stream. Hope you're having a good day. Good morning. Maybe you've checked out the episode today. Let's check the monitoring for a second. There we are. Nice, nice. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. I'll do the socials. Go on Twitter. I'll try to have the mic set up right in front of me today. Hopefully that will get everything, it'll pick up everything. It'll be a consistent audio stream. It'll be easy to hear. That's the goal. Then we can figure out everything fancier until then. Oh, none of these are sorted. But we have, well, kind of. We have fire stuff on the left. Vaguely, I can put all of the speech meta stuff on the right, and then we'll figure it out from there. I've been thinking a lot about where the censorship machine is moving. I think it is literally moving. It is physically moving to Europe. I think you'll see many of the people employed in existing positions, either at these companies or in the Biden administration, literally move to Europe. And that will be the new headquarters for the censorship regime. And it's really funny because the story around this has gone back and forth like a pendulum. But really, they got it right the first time, which is like in 2011, right? The story was just all about the Arab Spring 24/7 when it came to Facebook. We're doing regime change in the Middle East and we're doing it with Facebook. All of these grassroots supporters saw, the injustices of the old regime, the errors. They saw that the emperor had no clothes and they went out in the street. They protested. Some of those people they voted out. Others, they had a violent revolution. They got regime change. And by the mid-2010s, first of all, some of those regime changes didn't really play out. They just replaced one bad guy with another bad guy. But the other thing that happened was that by the mid-2010s, it wasn't just Middle Eastern dictators that social media was claiming. It was Hillary Clinton. It was, Boris Johnson. It was Angela Merkel. All these leaders in the Western world who thought that they were righteous and just, and that social media would bring democracy to their countries. If anything, it would help them. In 2012, it helped Obama, many say, who are now realizing that before, the real story about how they kept power was that they had very successfully controlled information in their countries. And that now they don't. They didn't. And they don't now. So what happened after that was that the legacy media went feral. This is what we still remember after 2016. You know, Facebook was a threat to democracy. It was the Russians. It was Cambridge Analytica. There's misinformation everywhere. They're killing people. We're now, taking this into the 2020s. And all of that was a push for more censorship. That, the machine that reveals that the emperor has no clothes, we wanted less of that. Less of that, please. And more of the old, monitored, controlled funnel that protected both people like Hillary Clinton and protected people, like the Middle Eastern dictators they were just cheering the downfall of. Turns out, we were just right the first time. And even the legacy media people, they were just right the first time, because they were looking at it and they were just seeing like what's happening. And the first look they had of it was actually pretty unbiased, because it was happening in all of these, Middle Eastern countries that they, didn't really have a strong opinion of. And what happened was that social media was a truth machine. It was a truth machine about the mood of the people. And, that doesn't mean that, like, literally every claim that people say on social media is true. What it does mean is that the mood, the will of the people, Vox Populi, voice of the people, was much more true on social media than on any TV channel or any poll. From Lebanon to America. So that's how Trump won. Now, what's Trump going to do? That's the big question. That's the question that I think all of you are here to listen to me answer. Hopefully, because that's the question I am going to answer now. What's the big deal? What's happening? Of course, the big news item around this is Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Meta, the king of Instagram, Facebook, and WhatsApp. He's changing his policies. He's changed his ways. He's going on Joe Rogan. He's talking about how the Biden administration threatened him and threatened his employees and threatened Meta, and how, all these European authorities are now doing the same thing. And he's, I think, really changing the policy at Meta. He had this announcement. He was moving to community notes. He was going to stop deboosting people based on these, quote-unquote fact checkers. And I had this post. Let me bring it up now. Right after Trump got elected, Politico asked me for comment. And what I said was that the era of trust and safety is over. It's just done. And I chose those words very specifically. This is something where, journalists are asking for comment. I'm not saying that, to them, I'm not saying, trust and safety is bad, trust and safety is good, trust and safety did all of these things. That's just a take, right? Trust and safety, the era of trust and safety is over. That's a prediction. Either it comes true or not. Either it's done, either all these programs are done or they're not. And at least at Meta, many of these programs, they're done. The era of trust and safety is over. Now, there's one thing in the video, and that Mark ended up talking more about on Rogan, that I am really excited about. This was the article I co-authored with Keegan McBride, who is a good friend and one of the good guys at Oxford. Both good and bad guys at Oxford for sure. So this is the quote that I was talking about. This is from his video. Mark says, he will work with President Trump to push back against governments around the world going after American companies and pushing them to censor. All of these bureaucrats, let me find it, who are, monitoring Musk's interview with AfD leader Alice Vidal. They're trying to look for justifications to censor, justifications to perhaps ban AFD, justifications to, fine X. There was actually some reporting, very mainstream reporting, that I can maybe find of them not just threatening X, but threatening just random other companies that Elon owns. Like, not even the company that you're taking a problem with. Not even the company that's enabling the speech, but they're just going after Elon, like they're a Chinese autocracy, quite frankly. And this is the line that I think Trump has to draw. For many years, there was this concept in the US State Department that we were going to promote human rights and promote democracy. This was, of course, famously, George W. Bush nation building. We're going to have democracy in the Middle East. We're going to have the State Department go out and fund programs and trainings and, journalism. And all of that, what was the goal? It was to have democracy. It was to have elections in the Middle East and for them to democratically choose their leaders. And if we do that, there'll be no more terrorism. And with Bush, that didn't work. And in many cases, some of these programs are overtly promoting very radical ideology under the guise of human rights. But the question is there a role for the State Department? Is there a role for the State Department under Trump, under, Secretary of State nominee Marco Rubio? What are they going to do? I don't think, quite frankly, I respect the Doge people. I respect the Trump administration. I don't think they're going to end the Department of State. I just don't think it's going to happen. But what they can do is go back to their roots. If there is one right, one individual right, which the United States is founded upon, it is the First Amendment. It is the freedom of speech. And the question you have to ask, and I do think it is a question, I don't think we have the answer yet, I don't think we know. But the question we need to ask is, in all of these countries that the US subsidizes, all these countries in Europe, all these countries in South America that the US is subsidizing, that the US is funding through all of these programs, are they committed to the First Amendment? Are they committed to the most foundational human right, the most foundational individual right in America? If they are, then that's good. That should be celebrated, and I would hope to see those policy changes imminently. If they are not, then if we expect the State Department to do anything positive under Trump, we should expect them to tackle this issue. I mean, just look at this. So, we have here, Brussels will be watching whether Musk breaks EU law in far-right live stream. You can't you can't interview the leader of the official opposition without the entire live stream being a far right. So is any interview channel in the EU now? Is any interview channel interviewing Alice Vidal, is that a far-right live stream? I don't know, maybe it is. Maybe that's the rule in Germany now. A team of up to 150 European Commission officials in Brussels and Seville will help scrutinize whether Elon Musk's social media site plays by the European Union's tech rules, censorship rules. That's, if we're being honest about what they do. They wield far-reaching investigative powers that allow them to visit X's offices and request access to its algorithm and internal correspondence. The Brussels-based enforcers of the Digital Service Act at the Commission's DG Connect Tech Department are assisted by experts in the European Center for Algorithmic Transparency in Spain. So, the whole context for this is that the EU passed this law, the Digital Service Act, the Anti-American Services Act, because none of these, very few, very small percentage of these companies are in the are actually made in Europe. Most of them are American. Some of them are Chinese, like ByteDance, the company that owns TikTok, but most of them are American. I think this is a line that I've been trying to push for a long time, actually, which Mark also said in his interview with Rogan, that all of these laws are anti-American tariffs. They are just tariffs on American companies, and maybe once in a while, once in a blue moon, on Chinese companies too. What's the enforcement on TikTok like? Not a lot, despite, pretty clear evidence that they're promoting Chinese propaganda. But, the EU has better things to do. They have better things to use these laws for. They're looking into whether Elon Musk is conducting a far-right live stream. That's where their resources are best spent, not on countering China. I'm joking here, of course. No one quote that out of context. But I am, that is clearly satire. And the point is that at the end of the day, it's very simple now. We can be honest about this now. There is the American interest and the European interest. And the European interest has two things that are in tension. They depend on being American allies and being considered American allies. And yet many people with real power in the EU, including the power to attack X, to attack Facebook, to attack all these social media companies, do not like the First Amendment. They do not, and to that extent, they are American enemies, not American allies. At the same time, I'm sure that there is, at least philosophically, a rich tradition of free speech in countries like the UK, even to some degree in France, parts of Europe. There's lip service paid to freedom of speech. And I'm sure there are individual politicians, maybe even some individual bureaucrats, who do like the First Amendment, who do like freedom of speech, and who actually are American allies. I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic that those people exist. I think they're real. And so, once again, with the new sheriff in town, with Donald Trump ready to take office, with Mark Zuckerberg now being, more than honest, being really honest about all of these things that have happened in the past 8 years, there's a fork in the road. You are for the First Amendment, the most basic human right in America, or you're against it. It is really that's all there is. You are an American ally or an American enemy. But speaking of American enemies, are we ready to get started on this yet? This op-ed by Peter Thiel, someone who you may have heard of. First outside investor in Facebook, now Meta. Was on the Meta board for a long time. The leader of the Tech for Trump movement, especially in 2016. He has a very interesting editorial out in the Financial Times. Not directly about Meta, but making some points that are very important related to it. let me just summarize the thesis of this piece and go over a few sections that I think are most important. This is a very cryptic line, perhaps the most cryptic line in the entire piece, but I do think it's the thesis. Trump's return to the White House augurs the apocalypse of the ancien regime's secrets. All will be revealed. Truth and reconciliation. What does that mean? It means, as Mike Solana put it, we will have the Twitter files for the US government. And he's not the first to put it that way. Many people, many such cases, many people are calling for a truth and reconciliation or a Twitter files for the US government. How much censorship happened? What were the internal discussions like around gain-of-function research in 2020? We still do not fully know. And soon, we will know. That is what Peter Thiel is telling us. The new administration's revelations need not justify vengeance. Reconstruction can go hand in hand with reconciliation. But for reconciliation to take place, there must first be truth. So we have two, or we have a binary and then we have another statement. We could have vengeance or reconciliation. But to have reconciliation, we need truth. This is, very thinly veiled threat. But you have to read between the lines, some may say. We cannot wait 6 decades, however, to end the lockdown on a free discussion about COVID-19. In subpoenaed emails from Anthony Fauci's senior advisor David Morans, we learned that the National Institute of Health, NIH, apparatchiks hid their correspondence from Freedom of Information Act scrutiny. Morans and former chief U.S. medical advisor Fauci will have the chance to share some indecent facts about their own recent plague. Did they suspect that COVID spawned from a U.S. taxpayer-funded research or an adjacent Chinese military program? Was it a Chinese military program? Why? Did we fund the work of EcoHealth Alliance, which sent researchers into remote Chinese caves to extract novel coronaviruses? We know that's what they did. They reported so in their papers. Is gain-of-function research a byword for a bioweapons program? And how did our government stop the spread of such questions on social media? So we're seeing this, tie back in with Meta and with, Mark Zuckerberg's decision and, truth and reconciliation. We know part of that question now because Mark went on Joe Rogan and talked about some of these intimidation tactics, talked about some of the takedown requests that they had over, information related to the pandemic. Our First Amendment frames the rules of engagement for domestic fights over free speech, but the global reach of the internet tempts its adversaries into a global war. We talked about this last stream. That has particularly important significance in the philosophy of René Girard, who was a mentor to Peter Thiel. Can we believe that a Brazilian judge banned X without American backing in a tragicomic perversion of the Monroe Doctrine? Were we complicit in Australia's recent legislation requiring age verification for social media users, the beginning of the end for internet anonymity? Did we muster up even 2 minutes criticism of the UK, which has arrested hundreds of people a year for online speech, triggering, among other things, annoyance, inconvenience, or needless anxiety? We may expect no better from Orwellian dictatorships in East Asia and Eurasia, but we must support a free internet in Oceania. Of course, this article is rife with references to literature, and I think it's very clear that Thiel is still holding back despite all of this, and we understand why. Perhaps he still needs to hold back. We're now in a mood that suggests that we have free speech, that we've won. And, Trump has won the election, promising to have much less censorship. But the question always remains, what will he do with that power? And what will the people under him do with that power? Will he be able to undo all of the censorship that happened? Certainly, there was censorship that happened under the first Trump term. That was when the pandemic started. That was peak censorship of gain-of-function research and of lab leak theory. That all happened under Trump. He was president. And, was he responsible for it? Was he, ignorant of it? Was he, all of those questions are, I think, fair to ask. But at the end of the day, they did happen under him. And what we don't want is for them to happen under him again. But you see this return to this question of whether the censorship in foreign governments are loyalty or disloyalty. Are they... And I really don't know. I really don't know what is the least offensive answer to this. If they weren't a sign of American loyalty, then these supposed allies, Australia, the UK, they're not allies then. But if they were signs of loyalty, well, we may expect no better from Orwellian dictatorships in East Asia and Eurasia, but we must support a free internet in Oceania. What about North America? Must we support a free internet there? Darker questions still emerge in this dusky final weeks of our interregnum. Venture capitalist Mark Andreessen recently suggested on Joe Rogan's podcast that the Biden administration debanked crypto entrepreneurs. How closely does our financial system resemble a social credit system where an IRS contractor's illegal leaks of Trump's tax cuts anomalous, or should Americans assume their right to financial privacy hinges on their politics? And can one speak of a right to privacy at all when Congress conserves Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, under which the FBI conducts tens of thousands of warrantless searches of Americans' communications? This is the other statement that I think is very remarkable in this op-ed. Perhaps an exceptional country would have continued to ignore such questions, but as Trump understood in 2016, America is not an exceptional country. It is no longer even a great one. This is a challenge, of course, and I think ties into what we were saying earlier. Every American right derives from the right to free speech. I do think the American founding was great. I do think the Constitution is great. I do think the First Amendment is great. It doesn't mean that America is no longer a great country, no longer an exceptional country. If it is indeed the case that all these countries, supposed allies, are being disloyal to America and actively opposing the First Amendment, then it seems America would be exceptional for being the only country with the First Amendment. That is, if America does have the First Amendment. If those countries were being loyal to the American regime, then they were in many ways, the American regime itself, along with all these other countries, were united in suppressing the First Amendment, suppressing freedom of speech worldwide. And by being united, America would not be so exceptional. I will. I think if you have eyes to see it, you will see that this this editorial alludes to many of the most important truths that we are not, the most important topics even. You know, they could be true, they could be false, that we are not allowed to ask questions about. That we are still, today, the date of the stream, January 11th, the date of the article's publishing, January 10th, still not allowed to ask. And I think, you know, the most important thing about this editorial is probably the tone. Probably that there's so much allusion to literature. There's an understanding. There's a shared understanding between Mr. Thiel and I think everyone who's reading this, who understands those literary references, that free speech hasn't won. We are not close. We haven't lost, but we haven't won, not yet. There's so many things that we cannot ask and we cannot know, and hopefully those things will change. Hopefully. Okay, let me take a bit of a break here. Let me put the next thing on the docket. The other thing that happened, of course, this weekend is the LA fires. I will have a very special guest to talk about this soon, Monday, and about all of this. And, you know, this is a tragedy. The fires were absolutely a tragedy. And increasingly, it is clear that they were a preventable tragedy. That almost everyone involved, from the from the LA Fire Department to the California insurance regulator to the US Forest Service, fucked up terribly in some way. And they all contributed to this. The through line is that we don't have meritocracy. We just don't. We just don't. And the question is why? Some people will say that the answer is DEI. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Programs that, instead of solving problems of merit or of competence, often prioritized the racial and sexual characteristics of their employees. Now, the logic goes, you're prioritizing these things that don't inherently matter, that aren't about competence, are often against competence, and, well, you're going to get a reduction in competence. And I think that, certainly think it doesn't help. I certainly think that, DEI is a waste of money. But it's an interesting question, to ask for the counterfactual. Let's say we got rid of DEI and everything else was the same. What would happen? Well, for one, the California regulator that made sure that insurance prices were inaccurate and that insurance providers had to leave the areas that the LA fires are now burning down. That regulator was established in 1988. Now, if there were more qualified people there, would they have made things better? Maybe. But these principles and policies and misguided rules and organizational hierarchies, they've existed for many decades. Here's the thing. I think the DEI story gets the narrative in reverse. You only get DEI once you have an HR system that no longer cares about merits. It's not like that these things just started off fine and dandy, that it was the most competitive company. No, that was not what the US government was like in 1988. And maybe that's the story in, Coinbase. Maybe that's the story in many of these American companies, these top companies that started off as top companies and then, 2020 rolled around. And you had this story where many of these companies were standing up to DEI, focusing on the mission, leaving politics at home. And all of that is great. I don't think that's the story of the US government. The best illustration, in my view, of the story of the US government was in this book by Jennifer Polka, the same person who's writing the article on screen right now, called Recoding America, an excellent book. And Jennifer Polka served under Obama, served with the Californian government, and, is by no means a right-wing person. However, by working in those circumstances, she observed exactly the failures of meritocracy that we're talking about. Not in terms of DEI, but in terms of all of these federal procedures that preceded it. So we have the story where, someone is trying to hire a web designer, someone who we would be able to find probably within days, if not hours, in Silicon Valley, for the US government, for the Virginia Human Resources team. The Federal Department of Veterans Affairs, my bad. The Federal Department of Veteran Affairs um, uh, IT team. So this is the U.S. government, and the way they did it is that this person who was trying to hire someone created, basically a job description, created all this information, and sent it to HR to create a job posting. Long story short, they took that job posting. They, had their own process, trust the process, and got back a list of candidates. And this list of candidates provided literally no web designers. None. Not, no web designers that met the standard, but just no one competent at all. Polka writes, this result is common, and it's why almost half of all competitive, open to the public job announcements result in no hire at all. If a hiring manager, like Marina, believes none of the candidates HR passes along can do the job, they can reject the cert, and they do, understandably, though at great cost. A hiring action can take months to get a cert, to get the list of candidates. So when you have to start this process over again, you're burning shocking amounts of time and attention. But here's the scandal. It's not just that no one applied. If you go back, many competent people in Marina's network did apply. And they didn't get through. Why didn't they get through? This other story illustrates exactly why. So let me skip some of the setup again. You have this guy, Jack, who is, a cybersecurity expert, found flaws in national systems in this hackathon. And he ended up trying to get a job at in the U.S. government with the Digital Defense Service. And he basically did the thing that you would expect to do in software or in academia and give a resume. And what the process for sorting through those resumes look like is that a government staffer looks at job description, looks at the resume, and tries to find an exact match of the text. That's it. And if you don't have an exact match for the text, even if you had all these specializations and credentials and qualifications and real work experience, you would get automatically rejected. Long story short, the article will be in the description, and you can find her book as well, Recoding America, if you want the detailed version. But long story short, if you want to get hired, 2 things you should do. Number 1, we already talked about, copy paste the job description into the resume verbatim. Number 2, they'll give you a self-assessment. And in that self-assessment, you should basically say you are a master level, the highest level in everything. Is that a realistic self-assessment? Not in the slightest. Is that just what everyone does? Yes. And you're in this circumstance where the rules that are laid out, which are very obtuse rules, very inflexible rules for how the US government must hire is just absurd. And you can have DEI, you can have no DEI involved at all. That doesn't really change the outcome. Maybe you're making small edits around the edges, but even just with what's already described, assume there's no DEI involved at all. Even just with what has been described, it is just absurd, and it's not how any functioning institution would work. And this applies. I checked right before the stream. It applies to, as much as it does to all of these software jobs, to the U.S. Forest Service and to many other federal regulators, and a similar process applies to California. So you have the setup where, in order to get a job at U.S. Forest Service, at these California regulators, to many of these government institutions, you have to, quite frankly, probably lie. Very few people are actually, genuinely the best candidate, the highest level at all of these various skills. But also, you have to have these very arcane and specific ways of copy-pasting text onto your resume and so on and so forth. This isn't a meritocratic filter. It's an anti-meritocratic filter. It is filtering out, probably, as many qualified candidates, if not more, as unqualified candidates. And there are some other programs, there are other solutions that are good at the federal level. That's important as well. Not sure how much time I want to spend on this. But, this is the disagreement that I had with some of the Chamber of Progress people in the podcast, is that, there are all these ways to make changes around the edits. When do we just say, whoever is maintaining these completely ludicrous requirements, these requirements have zero legitimacy. Any institution, any single institution, which is competent, which is functional, which does the thing it says on the tin, would not hire like this. If you're defending this, you're illegitimate. We will fire you. That's a solution. And I want a yes-and approach. I think it's a good idea to adopt many of the suggestions that Polka is writing about here. But ultimately, my disagreement with many of the people on the kind of center-left abundance crowd is that this is simply illegitimate. This is not the way any functional institution would go about hiring. And that we should be able to be honest about that. The lack of a legitimating order within the entire federal bureaucracy, and many state bureaucracies, and many local bureaucracies. That's the problem. And by rising to that challenge, you're not creating more problems, you're solving more problems. You're solving, in fact, the same problem repeated over and over and over and over again. Instead of, governing by exception and trying to carve out one tiny piece of territory at a time, let's just be honest about what the system is and what the system is doing. In other news, this is also about the fires, not really about the hiring, not really about the people trying to prevent the fires, but in part about the people who are possibly starting more fires. There is some documented evidence of this. The original fires, to be clear, the original fires appear to be, natural from nature. but there is some video evidence of other people starting fires in other areas, looting, so on. And, you know, there are people who run away from fires, and there are people who start fires for precisely the reason of looting, of violence, of, as Nate says, people who are antisocial by nature, whose capacity for living in an advanced society is made possible only by a vigilant law. And you see this because, it fairly reasonably, not only are the citizens of the Palisades and of, many areas affected by these fires, not only are, the citizens fleeing, but understandably, some of the law enforcement, not the fire department, but cops, they don't want to be in the vicinity of all of these fires. Perfectly reasonable. But what happens once they're gone? It is people who would rather, stay in the fires, literally risk, their lives, probably breathe in a lot of smoke, to steal and possibly to kill other people, instead of, just fleeing like everyone else. And fundamentally, there just are evil people. This is a truth that is particularly difficult to communicate in the modern day. Very often, actually, this is, many people ask the question that, many attribute to Peter Thiel, this question of, what is one thing that is true about the world that very few people believe? Very good question. And for most people who ask me that, that's my answer. My answer is that many people will just inevitably be evil. They will steal, they will kill, they will act in often legal ways with the explicit goal of harming others, either due to envy, either due to some kind of will to power, some kind of will to suppression. Some people are just evil. And in some cases, the only way to protect society from them is to keep them out of power. That is, some set of people who just should not be should be, stopped from holding office. And some other set of people who, we're seeing, you need policing. You need, in many cases, you need to put these people in prison. And that's the only way that you can stop the state of nature from reemerging. The Hobbesian state of nature. The war of all against all. Is there anything else that do people have questions about the wildfire? Maybe not. Maybe not. There are a few things that I thought of related to the first topic, back to social media, that I can move back to. You really should just listen to the podcast on Monday. I don't know if I should break the news here. It is an interview. It's no longer, it's not just a stream. But we are getting a new episode next Monday. You'll be able to find it here on YouTube and on whatever podcast app you use to listen to podcasts. And it is with, I don't know, I kind of want to keep it a surprise, but it is someone who has lived in LA. I believe was not, I'll have to check actually, but I believe was not in LA at the time of the fires, but has been in LA. Who is, who really contributed a ton in leading the charge of being, pro-free speech in tech. and personally contributed to that free speech in many ways. I guess this is still, probably dozens of people fit this description. Yeah, I don't know. I kind of want. I do want to keep it a mystery. I want to keep it a mystery. I'll keep my secrets. Um, Even someone related to this editorial. Even. We actually talked about the article very briefly, about this article specifically. We also talked about the Mark Zuckerberg thing. I think we started recording like right after the Rogan interview dropped. So we knew that like a Zuckerberg Rogan interview happened, but there was like literally not enough time for us to listen to the whole thing, or for me to listen to the whole thing before we started recording yesterday. It was after the policy announcement. The policy announcement was what, January 7th. January 7th. So it was after that. We talked about this a lot. Talked about the fires a lot as well. It's Yeah, I'm not going to say more, but it's a very exciting episode. You should definitely check it out, and it will be on this channel as well. You'll be able to see it on this channel. Should I read like my? So I had like a response to like this guy. Yeah, whatever. It doesn't matter. This is what I would do if I wanted to actually turn this into a reading stream. But the long and short of it is that Nate actually captures. I think like Nate falters on this because like some guy was like, oh, you're mischaracterizing Hobbes, and Nate is like, all I meant was the state of nature. I'm not, endorsing all of Hobbes' philosophy. But Nate actually, captures Hobbes' philosophy much better than like this other guy. And core to that definition is actually the distinction, a very important distinction that I've talked about on multiple streams, between a Hobbesian kind of equality, which is, I have the screenshot here, an equality of violence, essentially, the fact that we can all die, that people can just kill each other, and that, even if you're stronger, even if you're smarter, someone can just sneak into your home and kill you. When anyone modern really says, equal, that's not what they mean. They don't mean that we're all equal in death. I've talked about this on a previous stream. They don't mean that we're all equal in death, that we have equal ability to die and to be killed and to be, victims of violence. That's what Hobbes saying. That's not what, anyone in the modern day means. But, people try to conflate this, even though Hobbes explicitly says he's not talking about equal strength or equal mind. Though there can be found one man, sometimes manifestly stronger in body or of quicker mind than another. But, he goes on to describe how, even someone who is stronger or smarter can easily be killed by, these other people. Maybe that's no longer true, by the way. Maybe this is only true in the state of nature. It's not necessarily true in, a state of peace, in essentially a circumstance where there's rule of law, where there are cops and the FBI will stop you if you try to kill someone. So this is just, this is not true in the state of peace. This is true in the state of nature, and it is about equal vulnerability to violence, too often to political violence. And, we saw that very recently for better or for worse. Certainly for worse, but maybe it's good that, we've been reminded of this. But I think as a whole, for the worse, for sure. But yeah, you know, this is it's a long. So I wrote this entire thing like on my phone, so I didn't realize how fucking long this was. But yes, Hobbesian equality is very different from modern conceptions of equality. You just read the definition; it's very clear. Um, and this is even funny. I spent less time talking about this, but Hobbesian freedom is also very different from modern definitions of freedom, as you might see from this title. Liberty of the subject, that's you or me, consistent with unlimited power of the sovereign. Um, yeah, what can I say? What can I say? Um, yeah. So this concept of freedom, very different from what we might consider free, in both good ways and bad. But once again, this is not a reading stream, so I I will shut up about Hobbes from here. But yeah. Do I want to talk about do I want to talk about the classical liberalism stuff and like the woke right again? No. Check out my previous stream for that. That was actually the first stream, was talking about, you know, right-wing Marxism, which I think is a real philosophical strand. There are like I was talking about George Grant, who is like an explicitly Marxist conservative in Canada, and his kind of philosophy. All three parts of that article are now out, by the way. But yeah, just check out the previous stream for that. We can take a look at this article, which okay, I guess it was on the docket. This is a good Oron McIntyre article, as opposed to the article that I had a few problems with a few streams ago. But yeah, this actually kind of fits in quite well. So let's talk about it a bit. Okay, many conservatives and libertarians say reducing the size of government is their top priority. Elon, Doge, but rarely consider the factors that drive its growth in the first place. I was speaking recently with someone who not this week's guest, but someone who may be on the podcast in a future week, about kind of reforging a kind of either libertarianism or he might say libertarian nationalism, and like just what happened. This is actually I asked this actually. Now that I think about it, I asked that of this week's guest as well. What happened to libertarianism? Why is it like uncool now? I think even many libertarians would admit that. Well, let's try to find the answer. For many small government champions, institutional neutrality and minimal state powers are measures of success. Yet, they often overlook how these factors can make the expansion of the state inevitable. So, just kind of, in terms of like literature almost, I don't really like how this article opens. I probably agree with many of these premises, but you're kind of putting the premises before the challenge almost, right? Like the way if I were writing this article, in fact I've written an article more so about technology and about regulatory agencies that makes a similar point. I would say, here's the problem. here is how like the FDA is expanding its power ever more over industry and how it's become captured. Why did this happen? And then I would go into this, right? But let's keep going. I think in general this was a good article, but that's just one. It's not even like a philosophical disagreement, right? It's just a kind of literary disagreement. While libertarians hold varying views, many believe borders are an artificial state imposition and individuals should move freely at will. This belief that government should not favor any particular culture or people leads to multiculturalism, and this is a big buzzword, especially in Europe. Ironically, it also creates a need for a large state apparatus to mediate conflicts among diverse cultures. So we're starting to see some of the problems manifest in this article now. Once again, like I probably would reverse the order. But anyways. When America's founders broke from Great Britain, they did not seek to abolish all governance or grant unfettered individual freedom. They acknowledged the necessity of government, but believed it could remain limited if people shared moral principles and maintained personal virtue. Do we get the quote here? There's a famous quote that, the Constitution is only for a moral and religious people. Constitution, I should know who this is by. Only for a moral and religious people. I forget. John Adams, right. John Adams, one of the founding fathers. Early America included state churches, blasphemy laws, and strict standards for public conduct. Okay. So, there's this question of, a culture of free speech, right? This is how I would open the article, and I think this is more useful for a lot of the people listening to this. There's this question of a culture of free speech and a, law of free speech. I think that in many cases, the U.S. maintains, to some degree or another, certainly compared to many other countries, the law of free speech, the First Amendment. I think that's, one of the most valuable things about the U.S. government, the system of U.S. government, that remains to a large degree to this day. Certainly a lot more than you have in China, or even a lot more than you have in Germany. But there's the question of, what are people going to do in private platforms? Are people going to be, accepting of other people's speech? Are they going to try to go after their jobs, as we saw in 2020? Are they going to try to weaponize other government agencies in response to the speech that CEOs make, or even that CEOs simply allow other people, that allow their users to say on their social media apps? All of that erodes a kind of culture of speech, right? And the question is, if you want to keep the law, which, for the Constitution, it's a little bit more complicated, but with many of these other things, is downstream of the public, downstream of elections, downstream of what they do, then how are you going to preserve that upstream culture? There are these religious institutions, there are moral institutions, there are ways of life. The initial Constitution only allowed men who owned property to vote. And this is a good thesis statement. For Oron's article, when the social forces of religion and culture remain strong, the state can uphold order with minimal interference. So, there's this idea that in part comes from John Stuart Mill, and why I have some, disagreements with John Stuart Mill, even from the perspective of preserving classical liberalism. That's a can of worms in and of itself. Maybe I'll go more on this in the future. But that, and this is very explicit in Mill, that liberalism is a force to uproot taboos and traditions. That, many of these taboos and traditions either, suppressed speech or, suppressed individual liberty. And to be fair, some of them did. Many of them did. But at the same time, you need to ask the question in both directions. This is my main disagreement, Some of them may suppress certain individual liberties, but some of them may at the same time promote more individual liberties and promote them in ways that are better than, better than can be done with the states. Okay, so robust families and communities with a common moral foundation mediate conflict and discourage antisocial behavior before it demands government involvement. But when these social forces weaken or fracture, the state must intervene to prevent disorder. This dynamic explains why a government that does not favor a particular culture or its virtues will inevitably grow in both size and power. I think that, inevitably is. I don't think we know enough to say that it is inevitable. I don't think we have enough information to say that that is, so certainly true. But, certainly I would agree that, that's the trend, much of the time. And, Schmidt discusses this. Oron has a book that, draws upon a concept which Schmidt describes called the total state. Yeah, I don't want to, simply read all of this verbatim. You can read the entire article afterwards. However, the main theme here is that you have these two different, essentially, layers of society, right? You have culture, you have politics. Breitbart had the famous, Andrew Breitbart had this famous phrase, politics is downstream of culture. Is that true or not? Or is it, both, that it's downstream and upstream of culture? These things influence each other. I think that's closer to what's true. But essentially that when there's no cultural solution, when there's no implicit solution, there must be an explicit solution. And so if there's no implicit solution to, say, the case study of Singapore is very good. If there's no, implicit solution to maintaining order and to prevent, littering and, public disruption and, pollution and, drug dealing, then there must be a strong official role. There must be a strong legal role for the state in order to enforce such things. So, Oron writes, without a common tradition, no organic communal structure exists to mediate such conflicts, so the state must step in. In a multicultural country, the government must serve as a neutral arbiter among communities with different moral visions. Yet, no institution can remain truly neutral because moral neutrality does not exist. Public schools, hospitals, libraries, and armed forces became cultural battlegrounds as a result. Every clash of culture provides the state as an opportunity to expand its authority, imposing its ideology on fractured and atomized communities. Whenever people cannot agree or resolve disputes on their own, the government steps in, assumes that responsibility, and gains additional power. 3 points here. One is that, I know this because he's written so in his book, but Oron derives, many of his criticisms of institutional neutrality, or the possibility of institutional neutrality, from Carl Schmitt. And, once again, you should read more Carl Schmitt. You should, his, most famous critique of institutional neutrality comes in Political Theology, the essay in which he coins the phrase, sovereign is he who decides the exception, as well as, all concepts of the political are secularized theological concepts. But there is a lot to say there. There is a lot to say there. There is always the question of what maintains the institutional order. And the thing that maintains the institutional order regardless of circumstance, cannot be the institutional order itself. It cannot be, purely self-perpetuating, because ultimately there is going to be someone who, as Schmidt says, decides the exception. And which way does that exception tilt towards? Second point. You can believe that institutions... actually, you can believe that institutions can be neutral, and, this can still be compatible with the next point. But you can say that, institutions can certainly have, a spectrum of opinion. It can have, if you were thinking of, obviously very oversimplified, but just a scale from 1 to 10. You can have a totalitarian state that has, opinion of 10 for every single topic, that demands, absolute loyalty to a specific position on every single topic. Or, you can have another state that, say, at least has between, 0 to 1 on every topic, has preferences which may reveal themselves at certain points. But, I think we all understand that there are differences between, like the Soviet Union and, like, the American founding. Those are just different institutions. Those are different behaviors. Those are different standards. But you have these systems which iterate over time, right? Which adapt to the political environment, where some politicians win and others lose, where some bureaucrats continue to be hired, some are fired or, not promoted or so on, and lose power. And these systems iterate towards predictable directions. Now, I don't think it's always inevitable, but I think it's reactive to the society around it. However, I think the underlying point is true at least in recent history and in American history more broadly. This last point, wherever people cannot agree or resolve disputes on their own, the government steps in, assumes that responsibility, and gains additional power. Famously, this was the case with desegregation and in the occupation and reconstruction of the South. I'm not sure if Oron talks about that explicit. I don't think he's talking about that in this article, but that was one of the most famous categories of occupation. And once again, this is true whether you believe those enforcements are positive or negative, right? It is just true. It can be good that they're occupying the South. It can be bad, but in either case, it is a situation where the state, lowercase s, the government essentially, is gaining more power. And the third point, finally, is essentially that, with every expansion of power, the kind of realm of ideology grows as well. So, you have this concept of ideology, which I think is a component of culture, right? Is, maybe the political component of culture. I do believe that there are parts of culture that are not political. I do think you can have that. And which I'm not sure is... I'm actually not sure if Oron or if Schmidt would agree or disagree with that. But, you saw this in recent times, right? Where even your crypto company or your sports team or, or your video games needed to have a take, needed to have a position on whatever cultural issue of the day or whatever, political issue of the day, whatever ideological issue of the day. And you can see across time, it is just true, I think everyone agrees with this, that there was a point in time where they didn't have these takes, they didn't have these political pronouncements, they didn't have these, compliance divisions in each of their subdivisions where they focused on doing the thing. It's less clear with art, but, certainly in the case of just, a company that is trying to provide financial services or is trying to, host computer servers or something like that, all of that is, I do think that is capable of being much more neutral than it is now. And so you have a before and after. You have a very identifiable change, an objective change, and you can approve or disapprove of that change, but you have to acknowledge that it exists. And, the natural question that comes up is why? Why did that change happen? Let's keep reading. It does not matter whether arbitrary law comes from a despotic monarch, a technocracy, or a democracy. I'll come back to this. It will still feel oppressive. In a multicultural society with no unified tradition, all laws seem like an artificial imposition by a state disconnected from any single culture. While we may run counter to small government theories, vigorous government actions that defend a unified culture is often more likely to protect liberty than open borders and neutral institutions. Only a shared moral vision rooted in our nation's historic Christian faith can halt the spread of tyranny and preserve, very important distinction, preserve the liberty our forefathers envisioned. Unless the Lord builds the house, its builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches the city, the watchmen stand guard in vain. Just as a pet peeve, I hate these formats of quotes. I hate like mid-quote sourcing of like, quote part 1, mid-source, quote part 2. That just bothers me. Just say like the psalmist reminds us and then the full quote. Much better, much cleaner looking, just aesthetically more beautiful. No, I'm getting distracted, but it's interesting. It's interesting. Oron specifies a technocracy here. The classical formulation of course is monarchy, aristocracy, or democracy, right? The classical formulation in Plato, I am not exactly sure if it originates from Plato. I'll have to check that, but certainly which he describes very thoroughly. And many of the ancients agreed on monarch rule by one, an aristocracy or an oligarchy rule by many, or a democracy or anarchy rule by I misspeak. An aristocracy ruled by a few, or a democracy ruled by the many. And the point Oron is making is that cultures act as a kind of legitimating mechanism, right? The culture creates not just the law, not just what happens, but also manages the kind of perception or the norms or the kind of agreements around what happens, the implicit and the explicit. And once again, if you're in a situation where what gets legitimated is different from what gets enacted, then you're in a very tricky situation. That is historically, the struggle of monarchs, the struggle of authoritarian countries, is that you get this kind of Ceausescu problem, the dictator of Romania, who believed up until very close to being killed by his revolting citizens, who believed very close to that point that he was still loved. That everyone loved the system because they would profess loyalty, because you had to. It was an authoritarian system, and you profess loyalty until you get a chance to overthrow the monarch, overthrow the tyrant, and then you do that, and it becomes very unstable. This is the lesson of Timur Kuran in Private Truths, Public Lies, I believe is the right order. That's the name of his book. Yes. Okay. Now, what's interesting is that there's always this question of American exceptionalism or of American cultural exceptionalism, where I maybe disagree with Oron, where I think that you can have assimilation much better in America than you have in countries such as France or even Canada. We spoke a few streams ago about the philosophy of George Grant and about how Canada was kind of dissolving into a non-country, or into an American colony. Maybe just based on the article, I'm not sure we disagree on this because yeah, I'm still very critical of a multicultural society. But the question is there a way to kind of reforge a kind of unicultural America, right? Because I think that there can be an American identity, American nationalism, American patriotism, and there's this great speech. I'm not sure if it's still in my bookmarks. Let me try to find it, which Sagar and Jetty recently quoted from, I believe, a former president. Let me just try to find it. But essentially rejecting the notion of hyphenated Americans. That is, an American that identifies with their country of origin or of their race. We're not talking about American. We're not talking about Italian Americans. Not talking about Polish Americans. We're talking about just Americans. You're in America. You're a citizen. You have the rights of an American. You have the American culture. You contribute to America and contribute to the American nation. I still think that's possible. I'm not sure how possible Oron thinks that is, but we better hope it's possible. we better hope it's possible, right? Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. All right. Thanks for joining me. This was a very fun stream. Lots to talk about this week, and, as you might expect, lots to talk about on the From the New World podcast as well. I am very excited about the upcoming episode, which you can find on this channel right here. Not right now, but in 2 days. Or you can find at any podcast app. And you'll be able to find that at fromthenew.world on Substack as well. Highly recommend it. And if you want to support the show financially, that's the best place to subscribe. And if you just want to support the show in general, the best way to do it is to let a friend know, either in person or online, or let a friend know about the stream. We had a few people drop in and watch across the stream. I appreciate it. And if you want to increase those numbers, then a great way to help us out is to let a friend know, either in person or online. And hopefully you are not only helping them, but you're not only helping us, but you're helping them find something interesting and informative. Thank you.